Welcome everyone. My name's Tabitha Cave and I lead on safeguarding within VWV. And the other speaker today is Richard Hewitt, who leads on safer recruitment. So today's session, we're going to have a quick reminder about the charitable safeguarding duty, and then talk in much more detail about safer recruitment in the charitable context. We'll talk about recruitment processes, the checks that you can and should be doing, and then to try and put that into some sort of context, we'll run through some worked examples. As ever, we'll be really pleased to help with as many of your questions as we can get through in the session. So do please pop them in the Q&A box and we'll do what we can to respond to all of those. Okay, so let's start with a reminder about where we are with the charitable safeguarding duty. This is a slide that I've used quite a lot over the last 3 years now, about what you understand by the term safeguarding. And when I started doing these sessions in that sort of period, there was a real understanding that safeguarding absolutely related to the protection of children and adults at risk, or vulnerable adults as they used to be termed. But there was perhaps less understanding that in the charitable context, actually the expectations on trustees and charities generally changed. And it changed significantly at the end of 2017, when the Charity Commission published a new strategy and new guidance. And if we move on to the next slide, the Charity Commission at that stage said that they expected all charities to take reasonable steps to protect everyone who comes into contact with the charity from harm, and indeed to protect those people from abuse. This all originated, I think, from the investigations into Oxfam in Haiti. That related to the post-earthquake support that Oxfam provided, and to some 2012 investigations into sexual misconduct of senior personnel there. At the time, Oxfam managed that internally. They reported to the Charity Commission, albeit that they talked around misconduct without putting it in a if you like, a safeguarding umbrella, on the basis that the allegations that senior staff were using prostitutes didn't seem to relate to allegations against children and those prostitutes being underage. Now, what happened as a consequence of that was that the Commission reviewed their expectations. First of all, they ramped up the Charity Commission at serious incident reporting duty, but they also said, actually, we're not comfortable with talking about safeguarding just being the protection of children and vulnerable adults. We want to protect everyone. And as a consequence of changing their strategy and changing their guidance, they listed a number of things that they expect all charities to deal with. And that ranges from policies and procedures, about appropriate steps to manage risk, about how charities should deal with concerns and allegations, but it also included a duty to make sure that trustees, staff and volunteers are suitable and legally able to act in their positions. That's going to be the subject of today's session. If you would like more information about the broader expectations on charities and safeguarding, then we did do another webinar on that, and the recording is still available on our VWV Plus YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that you have the link to that to put it into context if that's helpful. Otherwise, I'm going to pass over to Rich to talk about safer recruitment in charities and how you actually do make sure that people are suitable and legally able to act in the positions you're appointing them to.
Thanks. Thank you, Tabitha. So I'm gonna move on and look at safe recruitment within the context of that charity safeguarding duty, and of course with a recognition that what we might be saying here in terms of best practice recruitment processes can't apply necessarily to all charities in the same way. And one of the messages that will come through from this is that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach for all charities, but it's about being able to satisfy that charity safeguarding duty by taking reasonable steps in the recruitment process to appoint suitable people, and in doing so to protect from harm everyone who comes into contact with your charity. So firstly, what do we mean by safer recruitment? It's a term you might not be familiar with. It is a familiar term to those charities who operate in the education sector, and it's something that developed out of the Soham tragedy that occurred in 2002 when two 10-year-old schoolgirls were murdered by a school caretaker, Ian Huntley. This was at a time when established recruitment processes were rare, and the vetting of applicants to determine suitability was also sporadic. What arose out of Soham was the Bishard Report, and this recommended a number of changes to the appointment process in the education sector, sort of prescriptive recruitment guidance, legally required vetting checks. There was also the recommendations to develop a national police intelligence system, and then the Criminal Records Bureau, which is now the Disclosure and Barring Service, also arose out of that. So what we have in the education sector is a prescriptive recruitment process and legally required pre-appointment vetting checks, and we also have those requirements in the health and social care sector as well, for example. But it doesn't necessarily apply to all charities because many charities aren't subject to outside regulation in that way. So as we said, how does safe recruitment apply to charities? Well, it's because of that charity safeguarding duty to appoint individuals who are either legally able to act in that position and suitable to act in their positions. And this will mean that all charities, regardless of size, sector, objective, resources, their beneficiaries have to consider how to recruit lawfully and appropriately. And this applies to staff, trustees, and volunteers. And as I said at the outset, we've got a large number of charities, many of whom are very different to each other, and a one-size-fits-all approach to recruitment is simply something that's not going to work. What you will have to do is decide what are reasonable steps as they apply to your charity, which is something we'll try and guide you through today. Firstly, what I'd say, and in terms of initial size and considerations, the recruitment process must be reasonable for your charity, and again, that's according to size, resources, objectives, beneficiaries in the sector in which you operate, and also the sort of role that you're making an appointment to as well. As I said, what the effect of this is that a structured professional recruitment process is unlikely to be reasonable for all. So it certainly would be warranted for charities with the resources to fund that process. And you would ask the question, if charities who can fund a professional recruitment process aren't doing so, then what's the reason? Similarly, if we've got a smaller charity with fewer resources, is it okay to do less, or in some circumstances do nothing in terms of professional recruitment? As we go through, just like to raise a couple of questions for you to consider to consider at the outset. So firstly, what would a third party think about your recruitment process? Would they consider it to be reasonable given the area in which your charity operates, the size and resources of your charity, and then the particular role for which you're recruiting? So looking at it from an outside perspective. And then secondly, if a trustee, member of staff, or volunteer caused harm to someone who came into contact with your charity or to your charity's reputation, would you be able to confidently state publicly that you've done all you reasonably could to ensure the individual was suitable to act in that position? So bear those two things in mind. Just a sort of small example that we had from the education sector was that from an early stage, in the Safe Recruitment Guidance, schools are being asked to put in their job adverts particular wording to say that the post was subject to screening and the successful applicant must undergo criminal records background checks, the purpose of which was to deter unsuitable candidates at the earliest opportunity. And we sort of trained lots of schools on this over the years, and we met quite a lot of resistance when we were telling schools to do this, on the grounds that we have to put all that wording in our job adverts, it's going to increase the costs. But our response was that you have to have a very good reason not to comply with guidance in this area. And if you were to appoint an unsuitable person who then caused harm, and you didn't have this wording in your advert, then you wouldn't be able to say that you've done everything you could. And to give cost as the reason wouldn't be a particularly attractive argument. Now, this wording is common practice now in the education sector, but it's just a small example of doing everything you can to say that you had taken reasonable steps to appoint a person or to determine that they were suitable. What I've set out to you here, while saying everything could be different for different charities, was I think let's consider what a full recruitment process might involve, and then you can determine how much of that is reasonable for your charity according to the specifics of your charity. So I've set out on the slide here what we would consider to be a best practice recruitment process. So, having a recruitment policy or indeed a recruitment statement, which is made available to staff involved in the recruitment process, and also to applicants. I think it's an important basis for your recruitment process or for a best practice recruitment process, as it helps everyone to understand what you do, how you do it, why you do it, and it's also sort of a means of explaining how you satisfy that charity safeguarding duty. Again, a one-size-fits-all policy isn't going to work, and therefore your recruitment policy really needs to be tailored to your individual circumstances. And then the other documents that I've got there in that box on the left are really ways of establishing a structured process, and they're also an audit trail to show that you're making proportionate appointment decisions. So are you thinking about the role that you need to appoint for, doing a skills audit, which you would then put into a job description and person specification, which can then inform your adverts as well? Do you use application forms when you are appointing people to work for your charity? Again, this is something that was brought into the education sector following SOAM. There was an over-reliance on CVs, but an encouragement to use application forms because it encouraged a more objective and consistent appointment process. And then if you are lucky enough to attract several applicants for a position, then have you got a professional and shortlisting process, which is also documented as well. And if after moving past that process, a panel interview, ideally comprising at least one person who had some training in recruitment or safe recruitment, would be an ideal way of determining whether a person is suitable for the position for which you're appointing. And then objective selection criteria to choose the most appropriate person for the role. Again, which is documented, which is based on objective selection criteria, which have been applied equally to all candidates. And then other points, such as dealing with the rejection of applicants, doing that in a uniform way. Not exposing your charity to any risks from unsuccessful applicants who could potentially bring discrimination claims, for example. And then having an offer of employment which sets out clearly the terms of the offer, and we would say ideally makes the offer conditional upon completion of vetting checks and references. Overall, the point being, objective recruitment decisions are made easier by having a structured process. If you need any help with documentation or with your recruitment process, it's something we advise organisations on a regular basis. And then supplementing the actual process by carrying out checks to help you establish whether a person is suitable. Again, the extent of the checks is to be determined by these specific characteristics of your charity and the role being recruited for. As I mentioned earlier, some charities, education, health and social care will be subject to legal requirements where they have to carry out all of these checks before they can appoint a person. But that's not the case. The charities were not regulated. Therefore, we set out on this slide what we think would be a best practice approach to the vetting of applicants. As I said, it does depend on your circumstances. Just looking at some of those checks in there, verifying a person's identity would be just to establish that they're the person who they claim to be. Right to work in the UK is because it's a criminal offence to employ people who do not have the right to work in the UK. Do you have to check qualifications? Well, yes, if they're a legal requirement for the post, you should be checking them if you are making them a requirement for the position, or ideally if they influence your appointment decision. Checking education and employment history is about establishing a person's suitability for the role, but also looking for gaps in that employment history, which might need some explanation because they may call into question a person's suitability. We've also suggested checking social media profiles that are publicly available. Any private sort of activities online that affect a person's suitability or could be a risk to a charity's reputation are well worth checking in the appointment process. And then references, ideally 2 professional references, which the charity itself deems satisfactory. And I should mention that is a subjective test. So what is satisfactory is different for each charity. We mentioned medical fitness. You may question that. The Charity Commission safeguarding guidance talks about only checking medical fitness for applicants where it's legally required for the role. If you do this, then you have to be careful not to discriminate on the grounds of disability. And then a declaration that a person is not disqualified from holding the role to which they're being appointed. Now, this applies particularly to the charity trustees, and I'll mention that shortly. And then Dbs checks, so checking a person's criminal record to determine whether they are suitable, and if you're entitled to do so, also checking whether the person is named on the children's or adults barred list, and I'll come on to look at that in more detail.
I think that's really interesting, because quite often when we're advising charities around safeguarding governance generally, when you talk to them about safer recruitment, you talk to them about recruitment checks, people automatically default to think about Dbs checks, and they don't think about the broader context of due diligence about someone's suitability for a role. And I think having that sort of pick list, if you like, that list of options of the sort of things that you may want to think about is very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think lots of the questions that are raised with this are about focus solely on criminal records checks, and the rest of it doesn't seem to be so considered, which is why we're trying to highlight the importance of that for you. So as we've said on a couple of occasions now, there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and what you will need to do as a charity is consider the factors that are relevant to the particular recruitment process that you're undertaking. And it's not reasonable to expect everyone to follow the same process. So we would suggest as a structure that firstly you consider any legal requirements with which your charity must comply, then the specific circumstances of your charity and its operations, and then to look at the role being recruited for and the associated risk factors to determine what level of recruitment process and the extent of vetting checks that you may wish to carry out. In terms of legal requirements, as we said, firstly consider them. If you have particular recruitment legal requirements to follow, then you must satisfy them as a minimum. And that will be your minimum standard with which you need to comply. If you don't have those minimum requirements, then consider these things in relation to trustees, employees, and volunteers. So for trustees, it's a criminal offence for a person to act as a trustee or a senior manager of a charity if they're disqualified from doing so. So that's contained in the Charities Act 2011. And there's also Charity Commission guidance on the automatic disqualification rules. For these purposes, a trustee is someone who has the general control and management of the administration of the charity, and a senior manager is an employee who reports directly to the trustees or who has responsibility for the overall management and control of the charity's finances. And these disqualification reasons include certain criminal convictions, including those for bribery, money laundering, terrorism. Bankruptcy is a disqualification criteria. If someone is disqualified from being a company director, they are also disqualified from being a charity trustee. How do you check this? Unfortunately, there's no sort of single list or register and therefore a mixed approach to checking is recommended. And we advise that the charities do this by asking prospective trustees to complete a self-declaration form to say that they're not subject to any of the disqualification criteria to the best of their knowledge. The Charity Commission provides a basic form, and we can also help charities produce more bespoke documents as well. You can also carry out checks at the bankruptcy and insolvency register, the register of disqualified directors, and the register of persons who've been previously removed as a charity trustee. So if you follow those steps, then it is very likely that you'll be doing enough to determine whether a person is legally able to act as a trustee. When it comes to employees, charities as a minimum must check that all employees have the right to work in the UK. It's a criminal offence to appoint someone, to allow someone to work for you who does not have the right to do so. But as we said, there are no other checks above that unless you have specific legislation which applies. In terms of volunteers, again, there are no legal requirements for unregulated charities unless that specific legislation determines that there are. Volunteers can be eligible for criminal records checks in certain circumstances, but you're still required to appoint and manage volunteers in a responsible way. Moving on to think about your charity and its operation. So where checks are not legally required, or where you've carried out the minimum checks, then you need to decide what is appropriate and proportionate beyond that for your charity. And we've set out on the slide there a number of factors to consider. I think one of the key ones for me really is the sector in which your charity operates, and the beneficiaries. Are they vulnerable, and who the individual you're appointing is going to come into contact with. So if your charity works with a vulnerable group, then yes, we would expect more to be done. If you were recruiting for a role which gives a person access to beneficiaries or to vulnerable beneficiaries, and again, we would expect you to do more in the recruitment process. And size and resources also comes into it. Again, the bigger the charity with greater resources, then I think more would be expected to discharge that charity safeguarding duty. And also, what sort of profile does your charity have? If you've got a higher profile, then perhaps it's easier for a trustee or an employee or a volunteer to carry out some act that would potentially damage the reputation of your charity. In terms of, we mentioned on there the safeguarding risk register policies and procedures. I'll just hand back to Tabitha, if you could cover that, please.
Of course. So one of the things that you'll be thinking about in addressing issues of safer recruitment is how they fit within the safeguarding framework generally. And the Charity Commission has made it clear that it expects all charities to have a safeguarding policy and expects all charities to include safeguarding on their risk register. So trustees are expected to have a risk register about key risks and how they're going to be managed. And safeguarding can either be added to the overarching one, or if you're a charity that envisages a number of different safeguarding risks, you can have a separate register to deal with that. What the Commission doesn't do is say you need to have a recruitment policy, but within your safeguarding policy, you should have some content around recruitment and how that will feed into the protection that you're giving to people associated with the charity from harm. And you may wish actually to have that set out separately. There's no problem with having a safeguarding suite of policies rather than having just a single one. And indeed, we'd be very happy to help in framing safeguarding safer recruitment policies for your charity. We don't have a one-off template because it's going to depend so much, as Richard says, on your charity's operation and the sort of people that you have working with your charity when it comes to thinking about what it is that you will do. But it will if you choose to have a recruitment policy, it would be sensible to make sure that it reflects the issues we've talked about today and the note that we'll be sending you. So there will be quite a lot of content to help if you're thinking about that. And of course, do get in touch if you'd like some help with a bespoke recruitment policy for the charity.
Yeah, excellent. So at the bottom of the slide, there's just some other things to consider. You know, does your charity have employees? If yes, then a more structured process would be expected. But really consider who else can a newly appointed person come into contact with as a result of the work they're doing for your charity. They're all risk factors which we should consider, and which might mean that a more structured recruitment and vetting process is required. And again, remember those two questions we posed earlier. You know, would a third party think you've done enough? Could you confidently say you've done enough to ensure a person was suitable to act in the role? And moving on to look at the role, and yes, much of what you then decide to do is influenced by the role that you're recruiting for. So I think we'd always start by having a look at the role and considering the unique risk factors that relate to that role. And the top three there being pretty key in my view. So does the work give access to beneficiaries of the public? Does the role involve working with vulnerable people? And does it give access to finances, to confidential information, to personal data, which you would want a person to use in a responsible way? If those factors are present, then for me there's a higher risk, and it's likely that more will be needed. More needs to be done to determine a person's suitability. Will the individual work alone, unsupervised, or will they be supervising others? Now, working alone could be an indicator of a higher risk because you have less control over that person. But again, working with others, I think, also requires a person to be able to work in a respectful way with other people, not to discriminate, not to bully, not to harass, to be able to work as part of a team. So again, integrating a person into your charity is also a risk factor that you should consider, and I think feeds into a responsible recruitment process. Where will the individual work? Will it be at your premises? Will it be in the UK? Will it be overseas? How much visibility and control will you have over the person that's being appointed? The less control that there is, or the less frequently a person is seen, then the risk is potentially higher. I'd also say that a prospective employee or trustee is likely to have more impact on your charity and on anyone else who comes into contact with your charity than an occasional volunteer who's doing duties for you that's supervised by employees. So a more structured approach is likely to be required for employees and trustees. But again, as I said, volunteers still need to be appointed and managed in a responsible way. So we mentioned Dbs checks, and lots of people are aware of them, and we get frequent questions about them as well. And and there's frequent sort of misinterpretation of what they are and when they can be obtained and when they should be obtained. So just sort of cover this for you. So what are they? They are essentially an official record of a person's criminal convictions and cautions, which is carried out by the Disclosure and Barring Service of the Dbs, which used to be the Criminal Records Bureau. There are 4 levels of the Dbs check: basic, standard, enhanced, and enhanced with barred list. What do they contain? Well, a basic Dbs disclosure contains information only about a person's unspent current criminal record, whereas a standard Dbs check contains information about their current criminal record, but also their spent criminal record. So that's effectively their expired criminal record that they wouldn't have to disclose in ordinary circumstances, and which is only disclosable if a person is being appointed to a particular role. So there are eligibility criteria that must be satisfied before charity can obtain a standard Dbs check. The same applies to enhanced Dbs checks as well. They contain spent information, unspent criminal records information, but also other information held by local police, which is deemed to be relevant to the role or to the reason for which the check is being requested. So you get more information, which is often referred to as soft information in an enhanced DBS check. And it's also possible as part of the DBS check to check whether a person is named on the children's barred list or the adult barred list, which would prevent them from working with children or adults at risk. Can you get a DBS check on the individuals you appoint? As I mentioned, there are eligibility criteria. Having said that, there are no eligibility criteria for basic DBS checks because of the information they contain. So anyone can obtain a basic DBS check should they wish to do so. But for standard checks and enhanced checks, well, the work has to be specifically mentioned in particular legislation. So the first piece of legislation is the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act exceptions order. So if a role is named in there, then it's eligible for a standard check. So that would include roles such as those in the legal profession, police, work in children's homes, work in residential family centres. There's a whole host of roles that are named in that piece of legislation. For enhanced checks, again, that's only available for particular work. So the work needs to be listed in that exceptions order and also in the Police Act regulations. So that would include work with children, work with adults, so care supervision, training, advocacy for adults who receive a health or social care service, or being a trustee of a charity for adults who staff engage in those activities will all be eligible for DBS checks. As Tabitha said, we've produced a sort of safe recruitment note for charitable organisations, and we do cover in there a bit more information on DBS checks, what they contain, how they're obtained, and the eligibility criteria. I should also say that the DBS has produced an online Dbs Check Eligibility tool, which can be accessed for free, and is quite useful if you're starting from scratch on that front as well. I'm also mentioning that a person needs to be eligible for a DBS check. There will be some charities listening and out there who are legally required to obtain a DBS check if a position is eligible for it. But that's not the case unless you're subject to particular legislation in that respect. We often get asked about whether an organisation can accept a DBS check that a person turns up with and says it's okay, you don't need to check me because I've already got a DBS check. Can you rely on that? Well, yes, legally you can rely on a DBS check obtained by someone else. But what I would caution is that they're effectively out of date the moment they're obtained, because they don't include any information that's generated after the certificate has been produced. So do be wary about the date. Do check the date of a DBS certificate and who it was obtained for and the level, and before you decide whether it's something that you would be happy to rely on. If a role is eligible for a DBS check and you don't have a legal requirement to carry one out, should you get the DBS check? Here I'd refer you to the Charity Commission safeguarding guidance, which says that the charity should always obtain standard or enhanced DBS checks where they are available. There is no requirement to obtain basic DBS checks, and I'd only say consider them if a standard or enhanced check is not available and your risk assessment of the post justifies obtaining a DBS check. And finally, the recruitment of ex-offenders. I want to be clear that criminal record doesn't prevent a person from employment unless they are barred from working in a particular role. And really checking criminal records just forms part of your judgment on a person's suitability. And when you do this, it's important to develop a set of objective assessment criteria that you then apply consistently to all applicants. You can't discriminate against an applicant directly on the basis of their criminal record, but we really should be treating those with a criminal record fairly and objectively in accordance with agreed criteria. And there's more and more awareness now, around this with applicants. So do try always to act in a fair way and to really examine the circumstances that lie behind a person's criminal record before you take a decision on their appointment.
Rich, just before you move on, we've had a question in about people who are new to the UK, or perhaps who've been away from the UK for a while, and what you can do to undertake equivalent checks, if there are any.
Yes, okay.
Could you perhaps address that too?
Yes, so it is possible to obtain the equivalent of a criminal records check in many countries around the world. So there is specific guidance, which I think will be on the government website, which effectively tells you country by country how you go about obtaining equivalent information in those countries, and so it's really quite helpful from a practical perspective. So yes, you can obtain the equivalent of a criminal records check, sometimes a certificate of good conduct. If a person's been abroad and been working as well, then we'd always say the references from work overseas it is something you should obtain. In this country, even if a person has not worked in the UK before, you can also still obtain a DBS check in this country as well, which would it may not contain any information, but would certainly serve to verify the fact that the individual was telling you they hadn't committed any offences in the UK before. So there are additional checks you can do for those who've been working overseas. And document retention. So we've talked about establishing a recruitment process and carrying out vetting checks. But what do you do with the documentation that you generate from that process? Well, firstly, we need to retain any documents from the process in accordance with data protection obligations. So effectively, we need a justification for retaining the documentation. Now, you're being asked to recruit in a way that discharges that charity safeguarding duty. And also you want to be able to demonstrate that you have done so. And for me, that does give you a justification for retaining information from the recruitment process. It's also a means of demonstrating that you satisfied those reasonable steps. So you do have that justification for keeping recruitment documentation, but how long should you keep it for? So for unsuccessful applicants, well, we'd always suggest keeping documentation from the recruitment process for up to 6 months, and that's time frame is suggested because that's the time frame in which employment tribunal claims for discrimination can be lodged. And you might be surprised to hear that those who don't work for you can bring discrimination claims against you, but the discrimination legislation does apply to job applicants as well. So having documented your reasons for rejecting a person and appointing others is a really helpful way of being able to defend any legislation that does arise if you're unfortunate enough to receive a claim. For successful applicants, then the documentation from the recruitment process should be kept for the duration of their employment or their relationship with you. And then after employment, we would generally say up to 6 years after employment ends, because again, that's the time frame in which breach of contract claims can be lodged. Now, it is different for different categories of information, and we'd always recommend best practice, having a retention of records policy, which is something again we do help various organisations with. If you're talking about information that relates to safeguarding that's generated during a person's relationship with your charity, then you'd be entitled to keep that for a much longer period, because for example, you may be required to pass that on to future prospective employers of that person, or to cooperate with the statutory authorities. So, say for safeguarding information can be kept for much longer. DBS certificates and whether they can be retained is again something that comes up frequently. There's a DBS code of practice which governs this and says that DBS certificates should only be kept in accordance with data protection obligations. That's in accordance with the reason for which you obtained it. You're obtaining a DBS certificate to determine whether a person is suitable based on their criminal record to work for your charity. Once you've taken the decision that a person is suitable and they've been appointed and commenced their relationship with you, then you've really satisfied the purpose for which you obtained that DBS certificate. And in order to comply with the DBS code of practice, it is at that point that the copies of DBS certificates should be securely destroyed, with originals being returned to the individual. Having said that, if you can establish another justification for keeping that information for longer, which might be a risk management process throughout employment or for a certain period of employment, then you may be justified in keeping the certificate for longer. But it is important to recognise that we can't just keep these as a general rule. So having sort of talked you through the theory there and the options that are available, we've got a number of examples, or 4 examples, which we'll run through hopefully to put it into a bit of context. And Tabitha, please do comment as I go through if you have any, if you disagree with any of my assessment here or have any comments. So our first example would be, it is a charity that provides accommodation to families in trouble. And what level of recruitment process should be carried out for employees who work in this accommodation and provide assistance to those families. And this sort of work is unlikely to be subject to detailed legislative framework. So we're talking about an unregulated position here. What do we need to do initially? My view is, well, firstly, we need to look at these risk factors relating to that role, and also the context of the charity. So firstly, we have an employee, so we have a clear link to the charity, which means that is a person who can impact upon that charity's reputation. We know this is the person who works in the charity's premises as well. So again, that for me is another sort of heightened risk factor. But mainly, having contact with beneficiaries who may be vulnerable is really the key for me here. Of course, they also work as part of a staff team. And with regard to the charity, I think the nature of the work, the fact they have accommodation premises, suggests that they might well have the assets and the resources to carry out a fairly comprehensive recruitment process. So my view with this one would be, in terms of the recruitment process, it should be fairly close to a best practice recruitment process that we mentioned earlier. So, a job description, person specification, an advertisement of the role, the use of an application form, and then interviewing and objective selection of a number of hopefully a good number of candidates. In terms of checks on these sorts of appointments, I'd say yes, we need to be checking a person's identity. Again, they're working with potentially vulnerable people here. We need to know they have the right to work in the UK. I'd say qualifications are probably something that are unlikely to be required for this sort of post unless they're being stipulated in the recruitment materials. And checking a person's employment history for me is important because, again, it goes to you're looking at their suitability and their experience for the role. But again, can we identify any gaps in that recruitment process, in that employment history that could affect their suitability? Yes, checking social media profiles seems sensible to me because we mentioned that can have a reflection on the charity's reputation. Ideally, 2 references from previous employment would be required as well. And I'd also suggest, once employment does commence, about having a code of conduct in place which sets out the parameters of what's expected with regard to the employee's interaction with both their colleagues and the beneficiaries using the accommodation. I think very important to have code of conduct in place because, as you said, it sets expectations in terms of what we want a person to do, but also what they mustn't do. In terms of Dbs checks, this for the employees, it really depends on what the job involved. Are they providing a sort of care and supervision service to potentially to children and vulnerable adults? If they are, then it's very likely that could amount to regulated activity, and therefore an enhanced Dbs check with bar list information might be available. If they're simply working in the house and they don't provide those sorts of services to the beneficiaries, then it's likely to be that only a basic Dbs check would be available. But given the risk factors that we've identified here, it'd be sensible, I think, to obtain a basic Dbs check before an individual is allowed to start work in that capacity.
Rich, I agree, and there are a couple of other points that I would say about that. So one of the questions we're asked quite often is about this resources point. And my view is, if you are providing accommodation to families in trouble as a charity, it may well be, as Richard said, subject to a different regulatory framework and regulated activity which requires checks. But if you've identified that it's quite high risk, whether you have the resources, limited resources to do it or not, my view is that those activities should be subject to a check, and essentially that potentially other services which are costing money should be displaced to cover the costs of obtaining those checks in these circumstances. And fundamentally, if that can't be done, that you would look at matters of solvency of the charity or its ability to undertake appropriate management level checks for the operations that are being done. So that was one question that we're often asked. The other was a question which we received earlier, which is around, is it fair to do social media checks for individuals when not everybody will be using social media? Our view generally is that it is appropriate, and with a lot of these things, it's about openness and transparency about what you will be doing. And if you have a recruitment policy, or you contain within your safeguarding policy, or your privacy notices, or whatever else in terms of data protection, that you're going to be looking at those things, then provided you're looking at freely available open social media profiles, then that is an appropriate and fair process to go through. Mm-hmm. The other question you've posed on that slide is an interesting one, and it's around adult beneficiaries using the accommodation. Often it will be a charity's decision not to undertake checks of beneficiaries, overt checks of beneficiaries, because it potentially would interfere with the very purpose of the charity and what you're doing. Rich, have you seen circumstances where that's been undertaken?
Not in terms of sort of criminal records checks, just because it's unlikely that the beneficiary is also carrying out any activity that would justify a standard or enhanced level check. And in terms of basic level checks, well, yes, I mean, that could be made a condition of the use of the accommodation in something like this, but it's not something I've come across before now. I mean, I would say you could have, as we mentioned, is certainly a code of conduct for those users of the accommodation to abide by. And if they're not followed, then the benefit of the accommodation is withdrawn. It's probably a better way to manage these things.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. So we'll move on to example 2, where we're looking at the appointment of a trustee. Of course, what we might say here is best practice, and it may be that you do think some what I might say is unreasonable, because it will depend really, I think, on how easy you find it to attract individuals to act as trustees for you. Here we're looking at the appointment of a trustee to a charity that provides regulated personal care to adults. So what sort of recruitment process should be carried out? Well, in terms of risk factors, I mean, we've got a trustee who's going to be partly responsible for the management of an operation of the charity. So there's heightened risks there, and they will have a say in the operation of the charity. They will have the potential to bring the charity into disrepute. If you make the wrong appointment to a trustee position, then how easy is it to then remove a trustee from that position? And of course, existing trustees need to act in the best interest of the charity when making these appointments. So I do think there are a number of factors there which sort of lean towards trying to follow some form of formal recruitment process for charities. The other big factor here being, this is the charity which is providing what is likely to be regulated activity to adults, to vulnerable adults here. Of course, we don't know if the trustee will have any contact with them, with the adults, with the beneficiaries, but certainly that for me is a heightened risk factor, and therefore we should be looking to make an appointment here that is as objective and professional as possible. Would you agree with that, Tabitha?
I would. I mean, the usual refrain is how very difficult it is to recruit trustees of whom you expect a lot, and who are not being paid for their services. Certainly, we think that charities should have skills audits so that they identify what skills they're looking for in their trustees, and that they undertake some sort of process in terms of assessing someone's experience, and in order to be able to determine whether those trustees are meeting that. That we bear in mind that trustees do have access to confidential information, and that when it comes to the checks that you should be doing, the Commission is saying you should undertake the essentially the highest level of check that is possible for people who are having access in that way. So I think whether they're barred from performing the role is really important, and whether a DBS check should be undertaken at what level, probably the highest.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's really important when you recruit trustees is making it clear that they understand their obligations. So making it clear that there is a discussion around expectations both ways is always an important part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'd agree with all of that. Again, having regard to the Charity Commission safeguarding guidance, it's quite revealing in terms of what checks they think should be carried out as well. So it's well worth looking at that. If you're not familiar with it, then we do provide a link to that in the guidance note that we'll be circulating. Moving on to the third example, so we have a charity recruiting an employee to work in their finance team. This person will have access to the charity's bank accounts and authority to approve transactions of up to £5,000 on its behalf. So again, starting with risk factors here, which is an employee who will have access to, well, it appears here to both the finances, likely to be confidential information as well, a clear link to the charity, so it has that impact, has that ability to impact on the charity's reputation. Access to finance and the authority to approve significant value transactions, the risk of fraud here, loss of assets, money laundering, all of which can negatively impact on the charity and its reputation. And I think we can probably assume here that if we're talking about these levels of finance, the charity should have the resources to carry out a proper professional recruitment process here. So for me, this is the sort of position where we would be looking at full, as much of that full best practice recruitment process as we can manage. In terms of checks, I'll be looking at again almost that sort of full range of checks: identity, right to work, qualifications that this person is able to fulfill this role properly for you. Checking their education, employment history, again that goes to their suitability and their experience for the role. Certainly professional references, and then it might be that depending on the role that there are relevant regulatory body requirements that need to be met, or just declaration that they're not disqualified from acting in that role as well. So do think about the specifics that are applicable to the role, to this sort of role. In terms of whether a DBS check is available, well, we looked at the legislation. Standard level checks are available for people who are working as accountants, but lower level finance roles don't fall within the legislation. So if we're talking about someone who's working as a cashier here, a standard or enhanced check wouldn't be available, but a basic level DBS check would be. And I'd say, given the risk factors here, again, it would be sensible to obtain a basic level DBS check before work starts to adequately manage the risk. Yeah, anything to add to that one, Tabitha?
No, that makes perfect sense to me.
And sort of final example, a volunteer wishing to help in the gardens of a local charity. The individual will not have any responsibility for vulnerable people, finances, or information, but will come into contact with visiting members of the public. So in terms of, I think here we have something where we have less of the risk factors in play. There might well be a clear link to the charity, and of course there is the opportunity here to come into contact with members of the public, although it's not a specific requirement of the role. We also it's a local charity, and therefore this might mean that it has fewer resources. Given those circumstances, and that there was a real absence of sort of heightened risk factors, I don't think we'd be looking at any sort of formal recruitment process here at all. Although we still act responsibly in managing the decision to allow someone to carry out those duties. So it might be that an informal interview is sensible, or at least a meeting with that volunteer and the other volunteers they'll be working with, or employees who may be supervising them. A written confirmation of the sort of parameters of the volunteering duties and other expectations on that person, and also in terms of what the charity will do with regard to the individual. Having a code of conduct again which governs their interactions with other volunteers, employees, and the public would be sensible, even if that's something that's on a website and linked to, or the individual is directed to. So much more informal, but still trying to have some control, and to say, well, we did act reasonably here for me is key. In terms of checks, again, they may wish to check a person's identity just to make sure they are who they claim to be, and possibly social media checks to make sure there's nothing out there which would lead a member of the public to be horrified should they come into contact with this person in the gardens.
And I think one of the things when it comes to volunteers is that you want to make sure that you have a record who's been volunteering, and ideally when, because it will help in the event that any concerns are raised in terms of managing that. You'll want to make sure that expectations of conduct are clear. One of the things that I'm a strong advocate of is a code of conduct which applies generally to people associated with the charity, whether it's visitors or staff or trustees or volunteers, so that there are just some basic expectations about acceptable behaviour around treating others with respect and reporting any concerns that you may have, and not engaging in unlawful activity. I think that having some mechanism to share those expectations is strong, particularly in what we're seeing with the Commission's expectations on charities to ensure strong safeguarding cultures, and that indeed may be helpful.
Absolutely. Just to clear up that final question about Dbs checks. I mean, only a basic Dbs check would be available, and it seems entirely sort of unnecessary for this type of role. So just moving on to summarise what we've discussed today. Clear, I think that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and you really need to consider recruitment as it applies to your charity, making sure that what you do is reasonable and proportionate. Your recruitment process and documents will need to be tailored to your circumstances. So do consider that. Again, that is something we can help with. We frequently help organisations with all their recruitment documentation, and to help them implement proper recruitment processes as well. And ultimately, I think asking yourself, do you do enough? And have you done enough with the appointments that you've made, really? I suppose as lawyers, we always think of the worst case scenario, and if that does occur and you are asked ever to make a public statement about something, would you be able to say that we genuinely feel we did enough in those circumstances. Okay, do we? I'm conscious we are tight on time. Do we have any more questions, Tabitha?
We do have a few. I am conscious of time. I've tried to address to pick up many of the questions as we've gone through. We'll try and get back to those people who have asked specific questions separately. So thank you all, and do please, if you have questions arising from the session, do please email either Rich or myself, and we'll do our best to answer them.